And we can break.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Jordan.
Okay, thanks. The struggle for human emancipation in the Anthropocene, which is the geologic epoch distinguished by the impact of civilization on the natural environment, is inextricably bound up with the project of establishing an egalitarian and ecologically sustainable economic order, namely communism. In seeking to understand the evolution of human society and the possibility of realizing this new order, Marx developed the materialist conception of history. Marx did not engage in a moralistic denunciation of exploitation and human bondage in the abstract. Oppression is as old as class-divided society itself, and its historical origins have been addressed by theologians and idealist philosophers. But until Marx, no one was able to explain the material and social foundations for the appearance, persistence, and eventual disappearance of class divisions. Now, key to the materialist conception of history and the practical project of transcending class society is the concept of the forces of production. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels observed that humanity, at a certain stage in its evolution, begins to produce its means of subsistence. Other animals, of course, do this to a limited extent, but production has fundamentally shaped our species. Production is essentially the transformation of natural objects by human activity into useful things, what we call use values or wealth. As such, it can be considered a process of material exchange or conversion occurring within nature. Momentum is generated in the first instance through the dialectical antagonism between the two sides of the exchange, namely humanity and the rest of nature. Now, in his useful, albeit flawed book, Marx's Ecology, John Bellamy Foster correctly stresses this centrality of this concept of material exchange. Foster refers to it as the human nature metabolism. And he stresses that it's central to Marx's materialism and cites Marx's important observation in Capital that, quote, labor is first of all a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. Now, this metabolic conversion of matter by human labor requires means of production. Combined with technique, labor power, and forms of organization, these means of production are the basis of Marx's concept of the productive forces, that is, human capacities to transform nature. The speed, efficiency, form, and purpose of this metabolic conversion, as well as its ultimate sustainability, are dependent upon a complex interplay of the forces and social relations of production that together constitute historically distinct modes of production. The history of the progress of human civilization, Marx argued in 1859, can be traced in the development of these forces of production through successive modes of production. Primitive communism, which was humanity's initial mode of production, was essentially egalitarian in structure and its distribution of social wealth. But of course, this was an equality of poverty, because the primitive productive forces yielded little more than basic subsistence, and humans therefore remained hostage to the vagaries of nature. Now, while the causes of the transition to class society remain obscure, it is clear that the material foundation of class divisions, and with them the attendant gender inequality and other forms of servitude, was the development of these forces of production to the point that it was possible for a tiny privileged layer of society to exist without directly participating in production, what we call a ruling class. Henceforth, the drive to enhance labor productivity or to increase the efficiency of this human nature metabolism was mediated by non-egalitarian social relations. Beyond the need to master the forces of nature, to protect the community from predators and other dangers, a new social imperative was developed. A new social imperative to develop the forces of production had also been introduced, insofar as this ruling stratum sought to increase its wealth at the expense of the laboring majority, or the direct producers of wealth. While this social imperative was deforming and frequently counterproductive, the historically changing class-based logic of surplus appropriation nonetheless led to progressive, if nonlinear, augmentation of human capacities through what Marx described as the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production. Capitalism, more than any previous class-divided mode of production, has enormously accelerated the development of the material forces of production. But of course it has done so not to expend wealth, the quantities of use values, but in order to maximize profit, with complete disregard for wealth, including the natural environment. Foster, following Marx, argues that the logic of capitalism, which is essentially anarchic and led by blind economic forces that operate behind the backs of human beings, is detached from the material human world on which it ultimately rests, leading to what he calls metabolic or ecological rifts through the same social process that Marx described as the self-alienation of labor. Capitalism has taken alienation, exploitation, and inequality to unprecedented heights, while providing humanity at the same time providing humanity for the first time with the possibility of eliminating these scourges through a fundamental reorganization of the social relations of production. In Marx's words, capitalism has created the material conditions for the solution of social antagonisms. While widening ecological rifts to an extremely dangerous extent and thereby imperiling the very foundations of human existence, capitalism has also created the material conditions to repair those rifts if bourgeois society can be eliminated before it destroys the environmental preconditions for human life on Earth. Now, Marxism provides a guide for the historical transformation of society through struggling for changes that both initiate the transition to communism as well as anticipate its early stages. In his critique of the Gotha program, Marx brilliantly sketches a transitional period between capitalism and the lower phase of communism, what Lenin and others characterized as socialism, during which society will still be, quote, economically, morally, and intellectually stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges, end quote. Nevertheless, the collective ownership of the means of production would represent a fundamental transformation in the economic foundations of society, vastly enhancing humanity's capacity to control nature. Capitalism is enormously wasteful, all the more so in the epoch of its decline, with an increasing proportion of human activity devoted to financial speculation, marketing, military expenditures, and other irrational overhead costs of the free market. The reorganization of economic activity on the basis of a rational plan would immediately increase efficiency, reduce waste, and dramatically improve the lives and tap into the energy and ability of literally billions of human beings for whom capitalism has consigned to hopeless poverty and privation. Marx projected that the continuing development of this socialist mode of production would ultimately result in communism, that is, a classless and stateless order, in which society will inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Yet, as Marx explains in the critique of the Gotha program, this will only happen, quote, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of common wealth flow more abundantly, end quote. The further growth of the productive forces is required to establish a material basis for the transition to communism. In the German Ideology, Marx and Engels explained that to transcend alienation in class society, the, quote, development of the productive forces is an absolutely necessary practical premise, because without it, want is merely generalized, and with destitution, the struggle for necessities and all the old filthy business would necessarily be reproduced. Now, many self-styled Marxists, including Foster, advocate a steady-state economy, and some even echo petty bourgeois environmentalist calls for degrowth. We believe that these perspectives are premised on the notion that the ecological destruction wrought by capitalism is a product of growth per se, rather than the consequence of the pursuit of profit maximization and the anarchic character of capitalism itself. Like Foster, many socialist groups tailor their treatment of sustainable development to the anti-technological and anti-growth prejudices of the green activists that they seek to recruit. Capitalism has, of course, developed the productive forces without regard for ensuring the well-being of our species and its ability to coexist with the natural environment. But even some of the more dangerous technologies and practices, such as nuclear fission, might be adapted to contribute to humane, sustainable development in a rationally planned economy, in which the associated producers factor in the environmental effects of particular technologies into their decision-making. Anti-growth advocates generally just simply reject the expansion of productive capacity on essentially moral grounds. Some environmentalists even favor a return to more primitive economic models and propose that the population of the advanced capitalist countries lower their standard of living, while those in the developing world should curb their expectations. Such notions are both reactionary and utopian, and have nothing in common with Marxism, which holds that only through the further development of the productive forces will it be possible to eliminate class contradictions and the unregulated, destructive interaction of humanity and nature. In his Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx described communism as, quote, the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, between man and man, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. Now, the historical agency for this communist transformation is the proletariat, a class with radical chains. In order to liberate itself from these chains, however, Marx observed that the working class has no choice but to collectivize private property and reorder the relations of production in an egalitarian and democratic manner. Insofar as there is an identity between communism and environmentally sustainable development, a political project capable of effectively addressing ecological crises must have as its goal the seizure of power by the working class and the imposition of what Marx called the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Yet many present-day admirers of Marx and virtually all green activists view this perspective as hopefully naive, outdated, and in some cases dangerous. While more pro-working class environmentalists sometimes put forward hazy calls for labor to take up the cause of sustainable growth, others are simply indifferent or even hostile toward working people who they view as myopic, conspicuous consumers, only interested in maintaining the polluting factories, mines, and refineries in which they work. What is necessary is an approach that links the strategies of redressing environmental crises and the growth of social inequality on the one hand, with a perspective of the socialist reorganization of society on the other. This, of course, requires organization. A revolutionary party capable of leading the working class and other oppressed layers to fight for state power. Building such a party must center on winning mass support for a revolutionary program that is a set of demands that constitute a basis of practical struggle, to guide the spontaneous movements of the workers and the oppressed in the direction of overturning the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and creating a new type of state based on democratic working class institutions. It has to be acknowledged that with very few exceptions, even the best exponents of the Marxist tradition have paid relatively scant attention to environmental problems. In recent years, the scope of ecological catastrophe has become obvious, with unambiguous consensus within the scientific community on the implications of anthropogenic climate change. Yet some self-described Marxists continue to downplay the dangers out of a misguided desire not to adapt politically to petty bourgeois environmentalism. However, unlike mainstream climate activists, Marxists reject the idea that capitalism can be incrementally transformed into an eco-friendly system. This is not to say that revolutionaries should be indifferent to particular instances of ecological degradation. Of course, it is necessary to be actively involved in struggles to resist corporate destruction of the environment. Yet, the chief responsibility of Marxists, we believe, is the attempt to popularize the understanding that such destruction is only a manifestation of the profound irrationality of the capitalist mode of production. The necessity of the revolutionary transformation of society through working class revolution has never been more urgent. Marxism offers the only realistic chance our species has for survival, because in the end, the problems of human freedom and sustainable economic development are inseparably intertwined. Both require the expropriation of the expropriators and the creation of a rationally planned socialist economy on a world scale.
Thank you very much.
Particularly kind. I like mine.
All right. So think about questions in the audience. Or